It was the morning of 29th September 1943, and a convoy of army trucks rolled through the quiet roads of central Texas. Inside the canvas-covered backs sat rows of German prisoners, men who just weeks earlier had fought in North Africa under Rommel's command. Now they were being delivered to a strange new kind of battlefield. Beyond the barbed wire and watchtowers of Camp Hearn, the prisoners expected harshness, maybe starvation or forced labor. But instead what awaited them were barracks with beds, hot meals, baseball games, and something far more unsettling than any punishment: freedom of information. Each morning the guards laid out stacks of newspapers: the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, local Texas papers, and even a few German-language editions printed right there in camp. The Germans were free to read them. No censorship, no editor from Berlin filtering the truth. At first, the prisoners laughed. They assumed these papers were American propaganda lies designed to humiliate them. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, they began to notice something strange. The papers didn't hide America's flaws. They criticized their own leaders. They printed bad news. They argued openly. And that's when it began the silence. They stopped boasting about victory, stopped defending Hitler's promises. Some stared for hours at the front page, reading again and again the words that would never have made it past the censors back home. This is the story of what happened when German prisoners of war were given access to the unfiltered truth, and how a simple newspaper would do what no interrogation ever could. They came through the gates, believing the world was still theirs. It was late 1943, and train after train of captured German soldiers rumbled into the American heartland. Most had been taken in North Africa, veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who'd once driven panzers through the desert and believed victory was inevitable. Now they were prisoners far from home, watching the wide fields of the Midwest flash past the barbed wire of their train windows. For many, it was their first sight of America, a land they'd been told was weak, decadent, and collapsing under its own excess. But when the trucks pulled into sprawling compounds, surrounded by tidy rows of wooden barracks, something didn't fit the story. Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Each one a small self-contained world built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to house the growing flood of Axis POWs. Inside, the prisoners were organized by rank, nationality, and even political leaning. Officers in one compound, enlisted men in another, and soon the surprise deepened. They were issued clean uniforms marked with a large PW across the back. They ate well, sometimes better than American civilians under rationing. Many were assigned to work details on nearby farms, earning small wages in camp currency. They could attend lectures, play chess, paint, or join orchestras that performed for both sides of the wire. But the most curious sight was found in the camp libraries and recreation halls. On long wooden tables sat neatly stacked piles of newspapers, English and German alike: the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. Local town papers. No one ordered them to read, no guard explained why they were there, but the message was unmistakable. Here in the United States, even prisoners could read the news. To a man raised in Nazi Germany, that was almost unthinkable. In their homeland, newspapers were weapons of the state. Every headline, every photograph, every column of ink was approved by Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And yet here, behind barbed wire on the soil of their enemy, these men found words that were free. Some read with suspicion, others ignored the papers, entirely convinced it was a trick. But a few began to notice that these stories were not carefully written to glorify victory. They reported on labor strikes, on war shortages, even on political disagreements. These weren't lies crafted for morale. They were messy, imperfect, and real. It was the first crack in the armor of certainty. As one guard later recalled, you could tell the ones who started to see it. They didn't argue as much. They just got quiet, and that quiet soon would spread. What do you do? One American guard asked years later, when a man realizes that everything he's been told about his enemy and his own country might have been a lie. For the German prisoners, the shock began quietly. It started with disbelief, then confusion, then a creeping sense of unease. Each morning, when the camp loudspeakers finished, the roll call guards would toss the latest papers through the open doors of the barracks. The men gathered around the tables, half mocking the idea of American free press. Others peered curiously at the headlines. The New York Times ran a story on Roosevelt's upcoming speech. The Chicago Tribune debated the cost of the war. Local paper discussed baseball scores and small-town news. None of it was the voice of a single leader. It was a chorus of opinion. At first, the Germans laughed. Propaganda, they muttered. All propaganda. But the laughter didn't last, because there were contradictions that shouldn't have existed if the papers were lying. One column supported the president, another criticized him harshly. One newspaper celebrated the army's progress in Italy, another condemned the loss of American lives as needless. How could propaganda be so divided? The prisoners began to realize that in America, newspapers could argue openly even against their own government without fear. And that idea was more disorienting than any battlefield defeat. Back home, such words would have earned a prison sentence, or worse. In Germany, only one truth existed, the party's truth. But in these American newspapers, they found the chaos of democracy laid bare: economic debates, racial tensions, labor strikes, criticism of generals and politicians alike. Prisoners. It felt as if the entire country was shouting at itself and somehow still functioning. Some POWs thought it was weakness, others saw something else, a kind of strength that didn't rely on silence or obedience. One prisoner later recalled, "We were stunned. The Americans were free to print their problems, their failures. In Germany, we only heard of triumphs. It was the first time I realized how deeply we had been lied to." Soon the camp library began stocking even more papers. Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, even Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Army's own paper. The guards didn't hide bad news, they allowed the prisoners to see it all. And what shook them most wasn't the victories or the losses. It was the ordinary life between the headlines, articles about movie stars, advertisements for new washing machines, reports of elections still being held. While the war raged, Germany was crumbling under total war, its cities bombed into ash. But here life went on, open, loud, unafraid, for men raised in a world of fear and obedience. It was like staring into another planet. Many turned the pages, slowly uncertain whether to believe what they read. But even disbelief couldn't stop the questions forming in their minds. If the newspapers were true, if Americans really lived like this, then what else had they been wrong about? And so, bit by bit, the confidence that had once filled those camps began to fade. They read, they paused, and then they stopped talking. In the early months of captivity, the German camps in America were loud places, marching songs, shouted orders, endless debates about Hitler's next victory. But by the spring of 1944, something had changed. The noise was fading. A few of the American guards noticed first. They said the prisoners no longer argued late into the night. Fewer of them saluted the portraits of the Führer. Some had secretly pinned to their bunks. There were fewer speeches, fewer boasts. In their place came long silences, men sitting on the steps of their barracks, papers folded neatly beside them, staring at nothing. One guard at Camp Atterbury later said, "When the mail came, they were loud. When the newspapers came, they were quiet." Inside those silences, a quiet reckoning was taking place. For the first time, German soldiers were seeing their country through the lens of foreign eyes, without censors, without propaganda. They read of Allied bombings that their own government had hidden. They saw casualty numbers that contradicted what Berlin radio had claimed. They read eyewitness accounts of German atrocities in occupied Europe. Stories they had been told were fabrications, and yet they appeared not in a single newspaper, but in dozens. At first they denied it. Then they wondered. Then, slowly, some believed A few brave men began translating English articles aloud for others. Some even learned the language faster, just to understand the editorials better. The camp library reported a sudden demand for English. Dictionaries and grammar books. One German prisoner later wrote in a post-war memoir. The newspapers did not shout at us. They simply told us things as they were, and that was more powerful than any loudspeaker. There were debates, of course. Some prisoners insisted it was all lies that the Americans were trying to reprogram them. But as months passed, those voices grew weaker. Every new issue of the paper brought more details, more photos, more evidence of a world beyond Nazi control. And while the German-language papers printed within the camps like Der Ruf were supervised by US officials, they were not propaganda sheets. They were written by German POWs themselves, often men who had already begun to question Hitler's vision. Their columns urged readers to think for themselves to separate Germany's future from the regime that had brought it to ruin. That too made some fall silent, because deep down, many realized that the war was no longer about victory, it was about survival. The silence wasn't surrender, it was understanding. By now, some prisoners treated the daily paper with the same ritual reverence they once gave their field manuals. They read it cover to cover, passed it along, and then sat quietly, trying to reconcile two worlds, the one they'd been told existed and the one printed in black and white before their eyes. For many, it was the first time they'd felt the true weight of truth, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. But not everyone welcomed the truth in print. For every prisoner who fell silent, there was another who clung desperately to the only world he knew. Inside, the wire belief became a battlefield of its own. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, and later at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, tensions rose sharply between two factions of prisoners. The primachinged anti-Nazis who had begun to accept what they read, and the loyalists who still swore allegiance to Hitler and dismissed the newspapers as American trickery. The loyalists were organized, disciplined, and dangerous. They wore their hair propped in regulation, military style, and addressed one another by rank. In some camps, they even ran secret courts that punished men accused of betrayal. When anti-Nazi prisoners discussed what they'd read in the New York Times or Stars and Stripes, the loyalists glared. Sometimes they whispered threats. Sometimes those threats became more. At Camp Tonkawa, one night in November 1943, a German prisoner named Johannes Kunze was found dead, beaten and strangled by his fellow inmates after being accused of helping the Americans. The motive: he had dared to agree that Germany might lose the war, and had been seen reading American newspapers too often. The killing sent shockwaves through the entire POW system. Guards increased patrols, separated prisoners by ideology, and quietly began to monitor who read the papers and who refused to post. Yet, even with fear in the air, many continued to read. Some POWs hid their newspapers under mattresses, studying them in secret. Others pretended indifference during the day, then gathered quietly at night to discuss the articles that had shaken them most. For those still devoted to Nazi ideals, the papers were a kind of poison. They saw every free headline as an attack, every column of dissent as proof of America's decay. They refused to believe that a nation so chaotic could win a war, but reality was beginning to prove otherwise. Each edition carried fresh news from the fronts: the fall of Rome, the bombing of Hamburg, the Allied push into France. The loyalists tried to explain it away, blaming temporary setbacks, but the headlines kept coming and the excuses began to sound hollow. Meanwhile, the camp administrators grew more deliberate. They realized that these newspapers, though never intended as weapons, were doing something powerful. They were educating. The US War Department even encouraged the creation of German-language camp newspapers, like Der Ruf, meaning the call, written by German POWs. It was allowed to discuss democracy, culture, and philosophy, but never to humiliate. The editors were prisoners who had seen through Nazi lies and wanted to prepare their comrades for the world that would come after the war. Each copy cost a few cents, not free, so the men would value it, and it circulated from hand to hand until the pages tore and faded. For some, Der Ruf was salvation. For others, it was heresy. And through it all, the silence spread, not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of men, realizing that truth could be dangerous even among their own. In that strange paradox, freedom of information was reshaping the enemy one reader at a time. But the real test was still ahead when the newspapers brought news from home that no one was ready to read. When the headlines stopped lying, the silence became absolute. By the winter of 1944, even the most loyal prisoners could feel the tide turning. The front pages told a story they could no longer deny Allied forces breaking through in France, the Red Army, closing in from the East German cities burning night after night. The camp libraries now stocked not only American papers but also carefully translated excerpts from foreign sources. The truth was impossible to escape. Some prisoners still tried. They called the reports fabrications, insisted that the photographs of bombed-out Berlin were staged, that the names of fallen generals were false, but even among them doubt was spreading. Then came the news that changed everything. In early May 1945, as they gathered for morning roll call, the guards announced that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. There was no cheering, not even anger, just stillness. The men stood in the yard, their newspapers dangling loosely in their hands, staring at the headlines. Germany surrenders unconditional. For months the papers had been preparing them for this moment. They had read of the Allied advance into the Rhineland, the fall of Munich, the death of Hitler, or as many headlines delicately put it, that the Führer was reported dead in Berlin. But seeing it in print in black and white made it real. For the first time, even the most hardened loyalists said nothing. A few days later, the camp received editions of Life magazine and the New York Times, filled with photographs from the newly liberated concentration camps Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The images spread quickly through the barracks. Rows of bodies, survivors like skeletons, piles of children's shoes. Some refused to look, others forced themselves to a prisoner. At Camp Clinton later recalled, "We had been told the stories were Allied lies. Then we saw the pictures. There was nothing left to say. The American guards noticed it too. The songs stopped. The arguments ended. Men who once lectured about discipline and destiny now sat quietly, reading the same paragraphs again and again." The newspapers had become mirrors, reflecting not propaganda, but the true cost of obedience. A few broke down. Others asked for more papers, desperate to totem. Understand how it had all gone so wrong. The American officers, unsure how to respond, allowed the flow of information to continue. They believed that truth, even painful truth, was the beginning of rehabilitation. And perhaps they were right, because in those final months something remarkable happened. Some POWs began to write their own pieces for Der Ruf, urging fellow Germans to accept responsibility to rebuild, to learn from what had happened. One editorial simply said, "The world we knew is gone. We must learn to think for ourselves, or we will never deserve freedom again." That issue of Der Ruf sold out in a single day. From then on, reading the newspapers wasn't just an act of curiosity, it was an act of rebirth. By the time the war ended, those who had once laughed at the idea of American truth now passed those papers around as if they were sacred texts. It was no longer about defeat, it was about understanding what they had really been, fighting for, and what had been lost. When the war ended, the newspapers stopped coming, but the questions never did. By 1946, the repatriation process had begun. Trainloads of German POWs boarded ships bound for Bremerhaven, their duffel bags packed with a few belongings, maybe a handmade souvenir, sometimes even a bundle of American clippings folded carefully inside. They were going home to a country that no longer existed, cities flattened, families scattered, a nation split in two. But many carried with them something invisible yet powerful, the memory of free information. Years later, historians would call it the quiet education. It wasn't forced re-education or propaganda. It was a slow awakening through words, through headlines, debates, and editorials that showed a defeated enemy, what freedom of thought looked like. Some of those men would become teachers, journalists, and writers in post-war Germany. Others entered politics or business. A number of them became the founding editors of the new Der Ruf, published in Munich, an independent paper calling for a democratic Germany, led by none other than two former POW editors who had first learned the craft behind the barbed wire. They called it The Call. because that's what it had always been, a call to think for oneself. In the late 1940s, when the Allies began rebuilding Germany's civic life, they found an unexpected ally. These former prisoners who had once read American newspapers in silence, they spoke of fairness, pluralism, and accountability. They remembered that the truth could survive disagreement and that a free nation could admit its own flaws without collapsing. One U.S. officer who oversaw POW education programs wrote later, "We did not lecture them. We only gave them newspapers, and that was enough. Not every prisoner changed. Some returned bitter, refusing to believe what they had seen or read. But for thousands of others, the camp newspapers became their first lesson in democracy, a lesson learned not in classrooms, but in the quiet of a prison yard with a paper trembling in their hands. And when those men told their children and grandchildren about their time in America, they rarely spoke of guards or fences. They spoke about the day they first read a newspaper that told the truth, even when the truth was painful. That small act, letting the enemy read freely, did something no weapon could. It planted the seed of trust in words again, and from that seed grew a different kind of victory. In war, victory is usually measured in miles gained or enemies captured, but sometimes the most profound victories are silent. On that day in 1943, when US guards casually set a stack of newspapers on a wooden table inside a POW camp, they could never have imagined the ripple effect it would cause. Those sheets of ink and paper didn't preach. They didn't demand loyalty. They simply told the truth, messy, contradictory, and human. And for men who had spent years reading only what their government allowed, that truth was louder than any battlefield. It stripped away illusions without cruelty. It replaced propaganda with curiosity. It turned enemy soldiers into thinkers and silence into understanding. For months and then years, those newspapers did their quiet work line by line, headline by headline, teaching men who had marched for tyranny what it meant to live in a world where voices could disagree and still coexist. When those men finally stepped off the ships in Germany, many still wore the grey uniforms of prisoners. But in their minds, they carried something priceless. The knowledge that freedom isn't a flag or a slogan. It's the right to know, to question, to doubt, and still be heard. And that perhaps was the greatest weapon America ever used in the Second World War, the truth printed daily for even its enemies to read. Because in the end, it wasn't bullets that silenced them. It was understanding. And that silence was the sound of change.